We now start to look at the gritty bit of the English language by starting on words, and we're going to start looking at words in one of the oldest ways that people have looked at words, namely by looking at their grammatical categories. People have been doing this for about 2,000 years, wondering why it is that certain sequences of words are permissible and other sequences of words are not. The assumption that linguists and pre-linguists have come to is that this is because words belong to categories. Particular categories go in particular places and they don't go in other places. So we're going to look at grammatical categories, and we're going to look at the grammatical categories of particular classes of words, and we're going to do that by looking at their inflections. To do that we have to make a distinction between the common or garden vocabulary item word, which is ambiguous in various ways, and the technical term lexeme, which is what linguists like to call words. To do that, let's look at a simple dictionary entry. It's the dictionary entry of the word sept, which most of you are not familiar with, but it makes for a nice, small, neat dictionary entry. At the beginning it says sept, S-E-P-T, and that of course is the form of the word. It's what you say and it's what people hear. At the end it says that it's a clan, especially in Ireland, so that's the meaning. And all symbols have form and meaning, as we've seen. And in the middle there is an N followed by a full stop. That's short for noun. Noun is a grammatical category. The word sept is a noun. So let's suppose that a lexeme is a three-part symbol, and the three parts are the form of the word. Later on we'll find that some words have more than one form, and that lexemes have syntactic categories, and that they have meanings. Sometimes, just as an aside, but we'll be seeing that later, dictionaries also tell you about some of the usage properties of a word, that is, where you're allowed to use it socially. If you see at the end of a word vulg with a full stop, then it's a word that you shouldn't use in polite company. Grammatical or syntactic categories, as they're also known, determine, as we said, where in a sentence a word can fit, and therefore there's one obvious way of identifying the category, that is, looking at phrases and sentences and seeing where words fit into them. But there is a second way, that is looking at the inflection of words. That's what we're going to do next, because it's a way of looking at word structure, and since we're looking at words we also have to look at their internal structure, and inflection is part of that. Let's look at the lexeme try, and it's in caps here because we're not talking about a word, we're talking about a lexeme, that is a word in your mental dictionary. Well, it takes a number of different forms. It doesn't always look like try, it sometimes looks like tries and tried and trying, that is tries, tried and trying. It takes different forms, and these forms are a result of where in the sentence the word fits, so they have something to do with grammar. Each of these we can call a grammatical word form. It's a form that a lexeme takes depending on grammatical factors, and the difference of one form to another has to do with the endings that the word has. It has an S on the end, or an ED, or an ING, and these are called inflections. Well, what isn't an inflection is of course the stem of the word, the bit that the inflection is tacked onto. So lexemes have a form, and sometimes a number of different forms, and those forms can have inflections added onto them. So we have stems and inflections. The processes whereby a stem can have an inflection added are morphological processes, because they have to do with the word's morphology. What does morphology mean? Morphology has to do with shape. If you study geomorphology, you look at the shapes that the earth takes. in the sense that it has mountains and rivers and valleys. Well, words have different shapes as well. We've just seen that. The word try takes different shapes, has different forms. So these are called morphological forms, and the processes are the processes by which those different forms are established. So a morphological process can add an inflection to a stem. But again, the process isn't random. You can't add any old inflection to any old stem, and so there have to be rules, and those rules are established again within the grammar in the widest sense of the word. The grammar is the set of rules that establishes what's possible and what isn't in a language. In order to know which inflections you're allowed on which kinds of words, you have to know something about the morphosyntactic categories within a language. In English, there are relatively few morphosyntactic categories. In English, for example, there is tense. Tense is a category that is responsible for the fact that English has past tense inflection, so you can put a past tense on try and get tried, and tense is a morphosyntactic category, and in the case of tense there are two properties, either present tense or past tense. The present tense is what you get when you add no inflection at all, and the past tense is what you get generally when you add ed. Well, the morphosyntactic categories of a language are established for each language, and some languages have really interesting morphosyntactic categories. In some languages you have to say whether the thing that you're currently looking at is above or below the horizon. That's a morphosyntactic category, and it has two morphosyntactic properties, above the horizon or below the horizon. That could be jolly useful if you're a member of a hunting community where it's important to establish where to look for something. Well, English doesn't have that morphosyntactic category. It has tense, and it only has two of them. And you'd think that was a bit of a worry. It has present tense and it has past tense, but it doesn't have a future tense. There is no inflection that you can put on the end of a word in English to indicate that it's happening in the future. That, of course, doesn't mean we can't talk about the future. We do, but not using tense. Well, it turns out that not all grammatical categories of words inflect. In other words, it's not a foolproof measure. Some words inflect for grammatical category, some grammatical categories inflect for things like tense, others don't. But the nice thing is that it is a positive test. When a word inflects for a particular category, then you can establish what category the word is. So, for example, if a word takes a past tense, if you can add a past tense to it, then it's a verb. If you can add a plural to a word, then it's a noun. Right? But the converse isn't always the case. If you can't add a plural, it doesn't mean it isn't a noun. So the inflection test is not brilliant. It's good as far as it goes, but it's not infallible. Not all nouns inflect for plural. Some grammatical categories don't inflect at all. When we look at prepositions a little later on, we'll find that prepositions have no inflections at all, at least not in English. So for the purposes that we have at the moment, we're only going to look at some grammatical categories, the major grammatical categories. 4 of them: noun, adjective, verb, and preposition. These are all of very long standing, and English has all 4 of them. There's a lot of evidence that all languages have these 4 categories. The others, the minor categories, a lot of which we'll meet later on when we deal with the grammar of English sentences, not all languages have. But these 4 seem to be necessary. Humans just develop these 4 categories in any language that they might acquire. Now the reason for this is they have crucial properties, sort of skeletal properties that every sentence seems to need, and perhaps they're what we need to express the kind of things that human languages express for us. Let's have a look at young boy sits in chair. This sounds a bit like pigeon, but essentially it tells us what we want to know. Boy is young, boy does something, sits where? In chair. Well, young is an adjective, boy is a noun, sits is a verb, in is a preposition, and chair is another noun. And we'll be dealing with each of these in turn. The major grammatical categories are central to sentence structure, and we need to understand how to establish what they are, and we're going to be doing that by looking at their morphosyntactic properties.